The year is 1917. Somewhere in the cold, grey waters west of Ireland, a German submarine commander peers through his periscope at what appears to be a crippled British merchant ship. Steam billows from her funnel. Her crew scrambles into lifeboats in apparent panic. One boat comes down end up, dumping sailors into the sea. A cook clutches a parrot in a cage as he abandons ship. The captain's wife stands helpless on deck. The U-boat commander smiles, another easy kill. He orders his submarine to surface to finish off the stricken vessel with his deck gun rather than waste a precious torpedo. As his conning tower breaks the waves, he closes to just 80 yards. And then, in the span of 2 heartbeats, everything changes. The merchant ship's bulwarks crash down, hidden gun ports spring open. The white ensign of the Royal Navy unfurls from her mast, and before the German commander can give a single order, a storm of shellfire tears his submarine apart. This is the story of Britain's most audacious naval secret of the First World War, the Q-ships. Merchant vessels transformed into floating ambushes, ships designed not to flee from submarines but to lure them to their deaths, and the extraordinary men who volunteered to sail them, knowing that their greatest chance of survival lay in first appearing to die. By the autumn of 1914, Britain faced a crisis unlike any in her maritime history. For centuries, the Royal Navy had ruled the waves through the sheer power of its battle fleet. But Germany possessed a weapon against which battleships were useless, the submarine. The Kaiserliche Marine's U-boats could slip beneath the surface, invisible to lookouts, immune to naval guns. They could strike without warning and vanish into the depths, and they threatened to sever the lifelines that kept Britain alive, the thousands of merchant ships carrying food, fuel, and munitions across the Atlantic. In those early months of war, Germany's submarines still operated under what were called cruiser rules, the centuries-old conventions of naval warfare. A U-boat was required to surface, identify its target, ensure it was not neutral, and allow the crew to abandon ship before sinking the vessel. It was civilized warfare, if such a thing can exist. But those rules carried a fatal flaw. They required the submarine to surface. And a surface submarine with its thin pressure hull and single-deck gun was desperately vulnerable. On the 26th of November 1914, First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill dictated a memorandum that would change the nature of the war at sea. His words were stark. It is desired to trap the German submarine which sinks vessels by gunfire. A smaller, moderate-sized steamer should be fitted very secretly with 2 12-pounder guns in such a way that they can be concealed with deck cargo. She should have an intelligence officer and a few seamen and 2 picked gun layers who should all be disguised. If the submarine stops her, she should endeavor to sink her by gunfire. Churchill added one final instruction. The greatest secrecy is necessary to prevent spies becoming acquainted with the arrangements. Thus were born the Q-ships, named, some historians believe, for Queenstown in Ireland, where many were converted. The Germans would come to call them U-boot-fall, U-boat traps. And for the men who sailed them, they would become floating theaters of death, where survival depended on the quality of their performance. The transformation of an ordinary merchant vessel into a Q-ship was an exercise in industrial-scale trickery. At dockyards throughout Britain, Devonport, Holborn, and secret facilities whose names were never recorded, shipwrights labored to create the ultimate maritime illusion. The ships themselves were chosen for their ordinariness. Colliers, the grimy coal carriers that plied Britain's coastal waters, tramp steamers with no fixed routes, fishing vessels, even sailing ships, their canvas and rigging unchanged from centuries past. The more forgettable the vessel, the better the disguise. Hidden within these unremarkable hulls, engineers installed weapons of surprising power. A typical Q-ship carried 4 to 5 guns, 12-pounders capable of firing 10 rounds per minute, sometimes supplemented by a 4-inch naval gun that could punch through a submarine's hull at ranges beyond 1,000 yards. HMS Dunraven carried no fewer than 5 guns plus 2 torpedo tubes. But the genius of Q-ship design lay not in the weapons themselves, but in how they were concealed. Bulwarks were engineered to collapse in precisely 2 seconds, revealing the guns behind them. Deckhouses that looked permanent were actually hinged panels of sheet metal, designed to fall flat and serve as platforms for the gun crews. Lifeboats were fitted with false bottoms concealing additional 12-pounders. Hen coops on deck hid machine guns, Even the ship's boats could split apart to expose their deadly cargo. Voice pipes ran along derricks and through rigging, connecting the hidden gun positions to the bridge, allowing orders to be given without visible communication. False funnels could be raised or lowered to change the ship's silhouette. Names were painted over and repainted. Some Q ships operated under 5 different identities during the war. The most remarkable example was HMS Hyderabad, the only Q ship purpose-built for the role. Launched in August 1917, she was designed with a draft of just 3 feet 8 inches, specifically calculated so that German torpedoes, typically set to run at 7 feet depth, would pass harmlessly beneath her hull. Every weapon aboard could be unmasked and ready to fire in exactly 2 seconds. But no amount of engineering could substitute for the most critical element of the Q ship's arsenal, the performance of her crew. When a Q ship sighted a submarine, the vessel's entire complement became actors in a deadly play. Their audience was a periscope, perhaps half a mile distant. Their stage was their own ship, and the penalty for a poor performance was death. Approximately half the crew would form what became known as the panic party, the men who would stage a convincing abandonment while the other half, the gun crews, remained hidden at their stations. The Admiralty's instructions were explicit. Crews must adopt the dress, manner, speech, and gait of merchant seamen. Navy-issued clothing was forbidden. Even Navy-patterned flannel underwear could not be hung on washing lines, lest it give away the ship's true nature. Some men were made up with theatrical paint to appear as black merchant seamen, others dressed as women, the captain's wife perhaps, or a passenger, but only from the waist up. Viewed through a periscope at distance, the illusion was sufficient. On at least one ship, the cook carried a stuffed parrot in a cage during the abandonment, a touch that one officer called the crowning glory of the performance. When shells began to fall, the panic party would dash for the lifeboats with carefully rehearsed chaos. One boat would be lowered clumsily, sometimes coming down end up and dumping men into the water. Sailors would rush about the deck, some carrying seemingly precious possessions, a pet cat, a box of secret papers. A steward might run into the captain's cabin and emerge clutching important-looking baggage. All of it was theater. Meanwhile, the gun crews remained absolutely motionless, hidden behind false bulkheads, crouched beneath collapsing deckhouses, lying face down on the deck itself. They waited. Sometimes for 15 minutes, sometimes for 40, sometimes while their ship took hit after hit from enemy shells, sometimes while flames crept toward their positions. Captain Harold Oughton, who had earned the Victoria Cross commanding HMS Stockforce, described the discipline required. They had to be taught to sit down or lie at their stations for hours on end without giving the slightest indication that there was anybody at all on board the ship. Everything depended upon concealment. When the submarine had closed to optimal range, sometimes as near as 50 yards, the captain would give the order. In an instant, the white ensign would break from the mast, the concealing panels would crash down, and every gun would open fire at once. The transformation from helpless victim to deadly predator took less than 3 seconds. For the German submariners, those seconds were often their last. The first unassisted Q-ship victory came on the 24th of July, 1915. HMS Prince Charles, a vessel of just 274 tons disguised as a collier, encountered the submarine U-36 off the Outer Hebrides. U-36's commander, having already sunk 14 ships on his patrol, saw easy prey. He ordered his vessel to the surface and closed in. At 600 yards, Lieutenant William Penrose Mark Wardlaw dropped his disguise. The Prince Charles's guns barked. U-36 was quickly destroyed, her surviving crew taken prisoner. The concept had been proven. The Q-ships could kill. But it was the Baralong incidents 1 month later that would demonstrate both the tactical potential and the moral complexity of Q-ship warfare. On the 19th of August 1915, HMS Baralong under Lieutenant Commander Godfrey Herbert approached a scene already in progress. The submarine U-27 had stopped the British freighter Nicotian and was preparing to sink her under prize rules. Her crew was already in lifeboats. Everything was being done correctly according to the conventions of war. Baralong approached flying the American flag, a neutral nation whose colors might offer protection. U-27's commander, Kapitän Lieutenant Bernd Wegener, took no alarm. The vessel appeared to be just another neutral ship approaching to rescue survivors. At half a mile, Baralong's guns revealed themselves. 34 shells struck U-27 in under a minute. The submarine sank in less than 60 seconds, and approximately a dozen German sailors were left struggling in the water. What happened next would haunt the Q-ship program for the rest of the war. According to American witnesses aboard the Nicotian, muleteers who had been transporting horses to Britain, Herbert ordered his Royal Marines to shoot the German survivors in the water. 4 Germans who managed to climb aboard the Nicotian were hunted down and killed, the last of them shot in the freighter's engine room. The killings provoked international outrage. Germany delivered a formal diplomatic protest, demanding Herbert be tried for murder. Britain dismissed the charges, but the damage was done. The Baralong was hastily renamed Wyandra and transferred to the Mediterranean. And German U-boat commanders learned a lesson they would not forget. The rules of civilized warfare no longer applied. If Q-ship warfare had a single dominant figure, it was Commander Gordon Campbell. No other officer exemplified the audacious spirit of the service more completely or paid a higher price for it. Campbell took command of HMS Farnborough in January 1916. A converted collier of 3,200 tons, she carried 5 12-pounder guns, 2 6-pounders, and a Maxim machine gun, all invisible to the casual observer. Her crew numbered 67 men, more than double what a genuine collier would carry, and every one of them had volunteered for duties so secret that even some members of the Board of Admiralty knew nothing of it. On the 22nd of March, 1916, Farnborough encountered U-68 off the coast of Ireland. Campbell deployed his panic party and waited while the submarine surfaced and approached. At 800 yards, he gave the order. 21 shells struck U-68 in rapid succession. As the submarine began to sink, Campbell steamed directly over her position and dropped a depth charge, one of the first successful uses of this new weapon in combat. U-68's bow erupted from the water and additional shells tore into her conning tower before she slipped beneath the waves. 38 German crewmen perished. But it was Campbell's second action, 11 months later, that would earn him the Victoria Cross and demonstrate just how far Q-ship commanders were willing to go. On the 17th of February 1917, Farnborough was patrolling south of Ireland when lookouts spotted a torpedo track approaching the ship. Most captains would have ordered evasive action. Campbell did the opposite. He deliberately altered course to allow the torpedo to strike his vessel, calculating that a hit in the cargo hold rather than the engine room would keep his ship afloat long enough to complete the deception. The torpedo struck aft, near the engine room bulkhead. The explosion was devastating, but Campbell had calculated correctly. Farnborough remained afloat, though she was clearly dying. The panic party abandoned ship with convincing desperation, and the submarine, U-83, surfaced to finish off its victim. What U-83's commander, Captain Lieutenant Bruno Hoppedey, did not realize was that Campbell had kept his gun crews hidden for precisely this moment. When the submarine closed to just 10 yards, close enough for the German sailors to see the stubble on British faces, Campbell gave the order. The first shell decapitated Captain Hopp. The remaining 44 rounds tore U-83 apart in seconds. Only 2 German sailors survived. The water around the submarine, according to one witness, was thick with blood and oil, but Farnborough was mortally wounded. As his ship settled deeper into the water, Campbell sent a signal that has echoed through naval history. Q-5 slowly sinking respectfully wishes you goodbye. Rescue vessels arrived within the hour. During the night, as Farnborough was being towed toward shore, a depth charge accidentally detonated aboard the sinking vessel. Campbell ordered his remaining crew to abandon ship, but Lieutenant Ronald Stewart refused to leave until his captain was safely off. Both men survived. Farnborough was beached at Mill Cove, County Cork, where she was later salvaged. For his actions, Gordon Campbell received the Victoria Cross, but he was not finished. He would command 2 more Q-ships before the war's end, earning a reputation so formidable that German commanders began to speak of Campbell's ships as though they were a force unto themselves. The action aboard HMS Pargest on the 7th of June 1917 introduced a new dimension to Q-ship heroism and created a precedent that had never before existed in British military honors. Pargest was another of Campbell's commands, a 3,000-ton tramp steamer carrying a 4-inch gun, 4 12-pounders, and 2 torpedo tubes, all concealed beneath her mercantile disguise. When the submarine UC-29 launched a torpedo into her engine room shortly after 8 in the morning, the explosion nearly betrayed the entire operation. The blast loosened the gun covers on the starboard side. If they fell, the hidden weapons would be exposed, and UC-29's commander would know instantly that he was facing a trap. In the chaos of the moment, a single seaman made a decision that would earn him Britain's highest honor. William Williams physically seized the falling gun port cover and held it in place with his own body. For more than 30 minutes, as UC-29's commander circled cautiously and the panic party performed their charade, Williams bore the entire weight of the cover on his back and arms, preventing the premature exposure of the guns through sheer brute strength. When UC-29 finally surfaced and approached to within 50 yards, Pargus guns opened fire. 38 shells struck the submarine in rapid succession. When German sailors raised their hands in surrender, Campbell ordered the guns to cease, but when UC-29 attempted to move away, he resumed firing. The submarine exploded and sank with only 2 survivors. The Admiralty faced a dilemma. The entire crew of Pargus had performed with extraordinary gallantry. Singling out any individual seemed inadequate. The solution was unprecedented. The Victoria Cross would be awarded to HMS Pargus herself, with 1 officer and 1 rating elected by their peers to receive the actual medals. The officers chose Lieutenant Ronald Neil Stewart, the same man who had refused to abandon Campbell on the sinking Farnborough. The ratings chose Seaman William Williams, the man who had held the gun port cover through nothing but determination and muscle. It was the first time in Royal Navy history that Victoria Crosses had been awarded by ballot. 2 months later, on the 8th of August 1917, Campbell led his 3rd Q-ship, HMS Dunraven, into an engagement that would test the limits of human endurance. Dunraven's opponent was UC-71, one of the most successful German submarines of the war. Her commander, Oberleutnant Zursee Reinhold Salzwedel, had already sunk 53 merchant ships and would go on to sink many more. He was not a man easily fooled. UC-71 surfaced at long range and began shelling Dunraven with her deck gun. Campbell sent a distress signal and dispatched his panic party, but the submarine maintained her distance, pounding the Q-ship from beyond effective range. 3 shells struck Dunraven's stern, the first detonating depth charges and wounding several crew members, the others starting fires that quickly spread. What followed was an 8-hour ordeal that would push human courage beyond any reasonable limit. The gun crews remained at their hidden positions as the deck beneath them grew red-hot from the flames. Unable to move without exposing the ship's identity, they lifted boxes of cordite ammunition off the burning deck and held them on their knees to prevent the explosive charges from detonating. Petty Officer Ernest Herbert Pitcher commanded the 4-inch gun crew, positioned directly above the after magazine. He knew that at any moment the heat might ignite the explosives beneath them. He also knew that if he abandoned his position, the submarine would escape. He stayed. The inevitable finally occurred. The after magazine exploded, blowing the 4-inch gun and its entire crew into the air. Remarkably, Pitcher survived, thrown clear of the blast and landing on mock railway trucks made of canvas-covered wood, which cushioned his fall. But the explosion had revealed Dunraven's true nature. UC-71's commander now knew he was facing a Q-ship. Yet even then, the battle was not over. A second panic party abandoned ship. Dunraven was torpedoed again. A 3rd group went over the side. Campbell fired 2 torpedoes at UC-71, both missed. The submarine, having exhausted her own torpedoes, finally withdrew, damaged but not destroyed. Dunraven was taken under tow but sank in worsening weather at 3 in the morning on the 10th of August. Only 1 crewman had been killed in the entire engagement. Campbell's assessment was characteristically understated. It had been a fair and honest fight, and I lost it. Referring to my crew, words cannot express what I am feeling. American Admiral William S. Sims offered his own verdict. I know nothing finer in naval history than the conduct of the aftergun crew. 2 more Victoria Crosses were awarded by ballot, to Lieutenant Charles George Bonner and to Petty Officer Pitcher. The men of the 4-inch gun crew who had held live ammunition in their laps while their deck burned beneath them received the conspicuous gallantry medal. Not every Q-ship story ended in victory. For every submarine destroyed, there were actions that ended in failure, in death, in the slow realization that courage alone was not always enough. Lieutenant Commander William Sanders of New Zealand earned his Victoria Cross commanding HMS Prize on the 30th of April, 1917. His engagement with U-93 was, in many ways, the classic Q-ship action, 20 minutes of sustained German bombardment endured in silence, followed by a devastating counterattack at 80 yards that appeared to destroy the enemy submarine. But U-93 had not been destroyed. Badly damaged, she limped back to Germany, where her surviving officers provided detailed descriptions of HMS Prize to German intelligence. The Q-ship's disguise had been penetrated. 3.5 months later, on the 14th of August, 1917, Prize encountered the submarine UB-48. Sanders ordered the white ensign hoisted and opened fire, but this time the Germans were ready. UB-48 submerged undamaged and stalked the Q-ship through the night. At dawn, she resurfaced and launched 2 torpedoes from 1,000 yards. Prize was struck amidships and disintegrated in a massive explosion. When rescue craft arrived, they found no wreckage, no bodies, no lifeboats. HMS Prize and her entire crew of 27 men had simply ceased to exist. William Sanders, who had endured German shell fire without flinching, who had waited until his enemy was close enough to touch before opening fire, who had earned New Zealand's only naval Victoria Cross, never lived to wear the medal. The Q-ship campaign did not exist in a vacuum. From the moment the first disguised vessel opened fire, a legal and moral debate raged through diplomatic channels on both sides of the Atlantic. Germany characterized Q-ships as fundamentally treacherous, a violation of the established norms of naval warfare. German jurists argued that Q-ship crews were Franksterrors, guerrilla fighters operating outside the laws of war, who forfeited their right to be treated as legitimate combatants by fighting out of uniform and under false pretenses. The Baralong killings added fuel to the fire. Germany's formal protest of December 1915 demanded that Lieutenant Commander Herbert be tried for murder. When Britain refused, German propaganda seized on the incident as proof of British perfidy. A commemorative medal was struck depicting the atrocity. The incident was debated in the Reichstag, where speakers described it as cowardly murder and demanded reprisals. The British position rested on the ancient naval tradition of the ruse de guerre, the long-accepted practice of warships sailing under false colors to deceive an enemy. So long as a Q-ship raised her true flag before opening fire, British lawyers argued she was operating within the bounds of international law. The concealment of weapons was no different from a warship painting over her gun ports to disguise her strength. But beneath the legal arguments lay a harder truth. Q-ships made following cruiser rules suicidally dangerous for German submarine commanders. Every merchant ship might be a trap. Every distress signal might be bait. Every panic party might conceal gun crews waiting for the kill. Germany drew the inevitable conclusion. On the 1st of February 1917, the Kaiser authorized the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare. U-boats would no longer surface, no longer warn, no longer permit crews to abandon ship. Every Allied vessel would be attacked without delay, without identification, without mercy. The decision was strategic as much as moral. German admirals calculated that if their submarines could sink 600,000 tons of shipping per month, Britain would be forced to sue for peace within 6 months, before American industry could mobilize. It was a desperate gamble, and it proved catastrophic. Unrestricted submarine warfare was the final provocation that brought the United States into the war. On the 6th of April 1917, Congress declared war on Germany. The weight of American industrial and military power tipped the balance irrevocably against the Central Powers. The Q-ships, designed to exploit Germany's willingness to follow cruiser rules, had helped create the conditions that made those rules obsolete. In doing so, they had contributed to a chain of events that would reshape the world. By the time the armistice silenced the guns in November 1918, the Q-ship campaign had become one of the most debated episodes of the war at sea. The statistics were sobering. Of approximately 366 Q-ships deployed by Britain during the war, 61 were lost. In roughly 150 engagements, Q-ships had destroyed between 12 and 15 German submarines and damaged perhaps 60 more. Yet Germany lost 178 U-boats in combat during the conflict. Q-ships had accounted for less than 10% of enemy submarine losses. Critics argued that the entire program had been a romantic sideshow, diverting skilled seamen and precious resources from more effective anti-submarine measures. The convoy system, introduced in May 1917, proved far more successful at protecting merchant shipping. Depth charges and mines ultimately killed more U-boats than all the Q ships combined. But the men who served aboard these vessels knew something that statistics could not capture. They had faced the enemy at ranges measured in yards, not miles. They had endured shellfire while pretending to be helpless victims. They had held ammunition boxes in their laps while their ships burned around them. They had volunteered for duty so secret that even their families could not know what they were doing, and they had maintained that secrecy unto death. 8. Victoria Crosses were awarded to Q-ship personnel, an extraordinary concentration of Britain's highest military honor for such a small force. Commander Gordon Campbell became the most decorated naval officer of the war. Lieutenant Ronald Stewart became the only Victoria Cross holder to also receive the American Navy Cross during the First World War. Petty Officer Ernest Pitcher's photograph, showing him between Queen Mary and Queen Alexandra, showed a jersey awash with medal ribbons. When Harold Oughton went to Buckingham Palace to receive his Victoria Cross in September 1918, the band struck up "Hush, Hush, Here Comes the Bogeyman." It was the nickname he would carry for the rest of his life. Today, only one Q-ship survives. HMS Saxifrage, a Flower-class sloop completed in 1918, lies abandoned at Chatham Dockyard, her hidden gun positions long since stripped away, her secret purpose forgotten by all but the most dedicated historians. But the legacy of the Q-ships endures in ways that cannot be measured by tonnage sunk or casualties inflicted. These vessels represented something essential about the nature of warfare in the industrial age: the willingness to deceive, to wait, to sacrifice everything for a moment of advantage. The men who sailed them volunteered for missions they did not understand, served aboard ships designed to be attacked, and maintained their disguises through bombardment, torpedo strikes, and fire. They proved that in modern warfare, courage could wear many faces, including the face of a helpless merchant sailor, a cook with a stuffed parrot, or a captain's wife who was neither captain's nor wife. As Gordon Campbell wrote after the war, attempting to explain why he had declined the offer of a second Victoria Cross, "I already felt that the Victoria Cross I wore was on behalf of my crew and through no special act of my own." In the cold waters off Ireland, in the English Channel, in the Bay of Biscay, those crews wrote their names into naval history through acts that could never be publicly acknowledged. Their weapon was deception, their armor was discipline, and their monument is the memory of the most audacious secret war the Royal Navy has ever fought.